Chapter 4. After another sleepless night, he groggily peeked outside. The sun was still rising, so he would have more time to spend today than the last. His stomach growled. He realized he hadn't eaten at all the previous day. He grabbed the wheat stalks he'd harvested yesterday from the corner and crawled outside. He had watched his mother craft bread before, and all she needed was 3 wheat stalks and a crafting table. But where could he find a table? Almost all buildings in a village had crafting tables. But most were now burnt to a crisp. He decided to check the blacksmith shop. He would enjoy seeing his father's home away from home, as he often called it anyway. Since his dad's old shop was just a little farther than the Fletcher shop, he made it there fairly quickly. Unfortunately, however, the entrance was blocked by debris. His stomach growled again. He needed food, and soon. I'll just have to find another way. He spotted an open window on the side of the building. The only problem was that it was too high for him to reach. In desperation, he ran and leapt, barely grasping the windowsill. He used all of his strength to pull himself up, his muscles straining. Finally, he was able to crawl inside. The one-room shop was a mess. Ash covered the floor and walls. The once hanging swords on the right wall were scattered everywhere. Even the front door was cracked in 3 places. It made him angry. Couldn't the zombies leave just one building whole? Luckily, the crafting table still sat in the left corner. It was damaged, but he didn't care. His urgency for food was growing. He began to feel faint. Hurry! He took the 6 stalks of wheat he'd gathered and laid them on the table. Suddenly, his hands began to move on their own, flying so fast they were a blur. His hands combined the wheat, then broke it in half. Then something happened, he wasn't quite sure what, and his hands came to an abrupt halt, holding 2 perfect loaves of bread. Though this might seem odd to some, he was used to this. He'd crafted many things before, including his cane fishing pole. That reminded him, did it survive the fire? He decided to search for it. After he ate, of course. After eating the newly crafted bread, he walked toward the window with renewed energy. But before he crawled through, he noticed the scattered swords on the floor. Of course. Why didn't I think of it before? He picked up a golden sword. Its shining blade made it seem magical, giving him hope. Wielding it, he took a practice swing. He expected it to be heavy, like the stone sword he'd once used, but instead, it was surprisingly light, probably due to it being made of gold. Now he would be able to defend himself. He climbed out of the window, his new weapon in hand. As he crawled outside, he saw it. Rain. If there was one thing he hated, besides zombies, it was rain. Why? Why not? Monsters could spawn in this weather, it made travel more difficult, and it got a person all wet. He groaned. Things were just starting to go well, too. Deciding that standing there wasn't going to make it stop, he stepped out from underneath the awning of the shop and dashed toward home. Finally, he arrived at his base. He quickly took out the loose floorboard and dropped down, sword still in hand. Once the floorboard was back in place, he breathed a sigh of relief. It was always a good feeling to be home. He took off his wet tunic and tossed it in the corner. It would dry overnight. He also did the same with his boots, as well as his new sword. He then lied down, the cold dirt sending chills up his back. I'll be glad when I can sleep on a bed again. Then he corrected himself. If. Closing his eyes, he listened to the rain beating against the roof. He was cold without his boots and tunic, but he tried to make the best of it. I never imagined sleeping on dirt. A tear ran down his face. Why me? Resisting the urge to cry, he soon drifted off to sleep, leaving his bad day behind him. Chapter 5. He stood outside, next to the village road, warming himself in the sun. Today's weather was a stark contrast to yesterday's, and he was glad of it. He decided after a while that he was wasting time. He needed to be doing something productive. Food was a major necessity right now, so he decided to find his cane pole and go fishing. Grilled fish was one of his favorite meals. Walking around the back of the house, he saw the cane pole laying on the ground next to the wall where he'd left it. But unfortunately, it was charred completely black. He picked it up, and it crumbled in his hands. So much for that. Then he noticed the brand new, metallic pole that Jackson had given him lying on the ground a few feet from where his cane pole sat. I'd forgotten all about this. He picked it up. It was in surprisingly good condition, besides some scratches on the rod. He was in luck. Smiling, he ran toward the lake. He could already taste a juicy, flame-grilled salmon. Soon enough, he reached the sandy bank. He was just about to cast it when he realized there wasn't anything on the end of his line. No problem. He put the pole down and began searching the ground until he found what he was looking for. A stick. Breaking off a tiny piece, he tied it onto the end of his line. Then, he put his rod down again and lifted a large rock near him. A big, fat worm sat underneath it. He picked it up quickly, not allowing it to escape into the earth. He then pierced into it with the tiny nub of a stick on his line. He made sure it was secure, then cast it into the water. This was something his father had taught him. If the fish swallowed the bait, the twig would get stuck, allowing him to reel it in with a minimal chance of the fish escaping. He hoped it would work now. Not more than a few minutes later, he felt a tug. His pole bent down, and his line took off like an arrow. He had something big. Reeling in as fast as he could, he saw his massive fish leap out of the water. It was the biggest salmon he'd ever seen. He reeled even faster. He couldn't wait to see it up close. After what seemed like forever, he finally got it on the bank. Big was an understatement. It was humongous. He measured it with his pole. The length of the rod he knew was 4 feet, so he laid it next to the fish, and seeing it was exactly half the pole's height, he determined the fish's length was about 2 feet. Wow! Its lower body was gray transitioning into white, with pinkish-red spots running below its lateral line. The upper body was entirely green, with black speckles. The mouth of this beautiful fish appeared similar to the beak of a bird. Though he'd caught many of these before, it always amazed him how many different attributes this fish had. He pinned it down, preventing it from flopping back in the water. He then took a large rock and struck it in the head, knocking it unconscious. The first time he'd watched his father do it, he asked, "Why did you do that?" The answer had surprised him. "It's better for the fish to get knocked out than to feel extreme pain as we fillet it." He cut the line with his teeth, then picked up the lifeless fish and his pole and headed home. Today is a good day. Once he got back to the old house, he put the fish down, removed the loose floorboard, and dropped down into the secret room. He grabbed the golden sword from the corner and climbed back outside. Using the blade, he cut deep into the skin of the fish, behind the pectoral fins. He then made another incision behind the anal fin. After doing so, he turned the blade 90 degrees inside the first cut and cut along the rib cage, connecting the two incisions. Now he took the thick piece of meat and laid it aside. Then he turned the fish over and did the same thing on the other side. It was a good thing his father had taught him this, also. After removing the second fillet, he took the remaining carcass and tossed it away from his house. A cat would eat it eventually. There were 3 village cats that he knew of, and all of them preferred to remain out of sight. Most of the time, anyway. They had to eat and drink, of course. Now the only thing left to do was to cook the fillets. Finding some sticks outside on the ground from nearby oak trees, he took and laid them in a crisscross pattern on the grass outside the house. Then he stood there, thinking of how to start a fire. Theo had shown him how to start one with a piece of flint and a steel ingot, but he didn't have either one. He'd also learned to start one using a stick and a plank, but that would take a long time. But better late than never, he supposed. He removed the floorboard that hid his secret room and took it back to his pile of sticks. He then laid it down on the ground. Taking the largest and thickest stick from the pile, he forced its tip against the plank. Then, putting his hands around the top, he moved them back and forth, rapidly twisting the stick. After a few minutes of doing this without ceasing, he saw a tiny puff of smoke emerge from the small hole he'd drilled in the plank. It was working faster than expected. He kept twisting the stick, even though his arm muscles were tired. He knew that it wouldn't be long until it would be ready to catch fire. A few seconds later, he finally removed the stick and laid it next to him. Then he shoved the plank underneath the pile of sticks and quickly began fanning it with his tunic. Before long, smoke began billowing from the plank. Then, a flame shot upward and the sticks caught fire. He knew that this small pile of twigs wouldn't last long, so he threw the larger stick beside him into the fire. He didn't need it to burn for long, just enough to cook his dinner, so he wasn't worried about firewood. The sun was already setting. The night was quickly approaching, and he didn't like it. Not at all. Relax. As long as I'm near the fire I'll be safe. He breathed deeply, calming himself. Night made him especially nervous after what happened to the village. The thoughts of zombies ambushing him out in the open sent chills up his back. Once I eat I'll feel better. He picked up the fillets and laid them close to the fire. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. His stomach growled loudly, urging him to eat. It had been a full day since he'd eaten. I've got to do something about this food problem. But he was too tired to do anything about it now. Sitting next to the fire, he thought of the future. He wondered if he would live like this for the rest of his life, working from sunrise to sunset trying to stay alive. No, he decided he wouldn't live like this forever. But where could he go? He'd think about it in the morning. The fish would be done soon, and all he wanted to do at the moment was eat.